Yeah, it's funny, you sit through enough of these panels and you start to have preferences on where you want the chairs to be.
Are you in the right spot?
No, now we have an arc.
Are you sure?
We can all kind of
I can trade with you if you want, but it'll be a little awkward back and forth. So. Okay. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Taylor Owen. I'm a professor at McGill and the director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy. And welcome to this year's Beaverbrook lecture. I am the Beaverbrook chair, and one of the great privileges I have is to host these events each year. This is the first time we've got to do it in person, though, since I've arrived at McGill. So it's kind of great to be in the flesh and back in 3D all together. This year's event is partnered with the law school at McGill, so thanks to everybody there who's here, the students and faculty who are here. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that the Center for Media Technology and Democracy and McGill University are situated on the unceded territory of the Gahaga, which have long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples. So tonight I want to talk about, or we get to talk, we have the opportunity to talk about a topic that I personally and the center that we run at McGill are really a question we're really involved in, both in the Canadian and international policy context, of what do we do with this problem and this tension between the free expression that is enabled by our digital technologies and the potential harms that can also stem from the design of those systems. And how do we as democratic societies decide to govern that tension in a way that maximizes free expression and free speech, but also minimizes the harms that we increasingly know are present in these digital systems. And I honestly can't think of two better people in the world to talk to us about that than Francis and Jameel. Really, this is a real treat, I think, for me, and I hope for you. Jameel Jaffer directs the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. He previously served as the deputy legal director at the American Civil Liberties Union. I had the pleasure of getting to know Jameel, and we served on a commission together, the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression, which explored these very issues. He then went on to slightly more august commissions to serve with Prince Harry on the Aspen Disinformation Commission, which a little more celebrity power than our humble Canadian commission, but exploring similar topics. So he is both one of the more thoughtful people I have ever gotten a chance to engage with on the challenge of free expression in the digital ecosystem, but also has been thinking seriously for now a number of years on what that policy and legal apparatus might look like to best mediate that tension I mentioned. Francis Haugen, as you all know, is a former lead Facebook product manager, turned one of the most well-known whistleblowers of our time. Haugen leaked tens of thousands of internal documents to the Wall Street Journal and testified before US Congress, the UK and EU parliaments, the French Senate, national assemblies, and has been working around the world with governments to both explain the importance and the nature of the documents and the research that she revealed, and also help them design policy mechanisms to address the harms that were present in them. And she's been also doing that most recently in Canada, where she's been engaging in various forums with policymakers as they enter into that very same process here in Canada, which we will get to in time. So I wanted to just kick off by giving each of them a chance to spend a few minutes talking not about the broad question of whether the internet is causing harms, whether we should be governing it, but to really zero in on this question of free expression and free speech. How should we think about free speech on the internet, in our digital ecosystems? And how is speech online different in character and type than speech offline? So Jameel, can you go first, and then Francis go after?
Sure, I would be happy to. So I was really pleased when Taylor and Sonia and Phaedra reached out to me about this event. This is a pivotal moment in the debate about regulation of new communications platforms, and democracies around the world are poised to adopt new laws meant to address harms ranging from monopoly power to child sexual abuse. And these legislative proposals raise really difficult questions, including questions about free speech. Many of the people who have thought most deeply about those questions are connected to McGill and to Taylor Center in particular. So I was really honored to get this invitation, and of course I'm glad to be sharing the stage with Francis, who has done as much as anyone to illuminate the ways in which platform policies may be causing real harms online and also offline. In the United States, which is where I work, even though I'm actually from Kingston, so, but I work in the United States, and this debate has been idiosyncratic in a number of ways in the United States. Many of the largest platforms are, of course, based in the US, and in part for that reason, they have a great deal of influence over the legislative process there, especially at the national level. The First Amendment, which gives really broad protection to free speech, has also shaped the debate in the United States, though not always in the ways you would expect. I'll come back to that in a minute. Perhaps the most distinctive thing about the debate in the United States is that it's become a front in the culture war, with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act now somehow occupying a place alongside affirmative action and abortion and gun rights in the national imagination, and the contest for control of social media platforms attracting political figures and hip-hop moguls and even spacefaring billionaires. It might be comical if there weren't so much at stake. But the question of who should own social media platforms and of how these platforms should be operated and regulated, these questions are among the most urgent ones of our age. The main reason for that, I think, is that these platforms are where a great deal of the speech that's most necessary to our democracies now takes place. Privately owned social media platforms are where we learn about the world around us, bring attention to injustice, organize political movements, hear from and petition our political leaders, advocate for change, and engage with other citizens. And the result of that is that the pathologies of social media are pathologies of self-government and even of self-determination. Around the world and across the political spectrum, people seem to understand this intuitively. There's a widely shared sense that our democracies are slipping away from us, and that social media has something to do with this, even if the precise causal links are difficult to identify and pin down, and even if the problems plaguing public discourse plainly have many other causes as well, some of them with deep roots in history. Over the next year, the debate in the United States is likely to get even more charged because the US Supreme Court is preparing to weigh in on these issues for the first time. The court is going to hear two cases called Gonzalez and Tamna about when social media platforms can be held responsible in court for harms allegedly caused by their recommendation algorithms. The court is also widely expected to take up two cases in which a coalition of technology companies called NetChoice has challenged the constitutionality of social media laws enacted recently by Florida and Texas. I think it would be difficult to overstate how consequential these cases are likely to be. In Gonzalez and Tamna, the plaintiffs are the estates of people who were killed in ISIS-sponsored terrorist attacks in Paris, Istanbul, and San Bernardino, California. The plaintiffs in those cases allege that the platforms allowed ISIS to post videos and other content to communicate its message, radicalize new recruits, and further its mission. They argue that an anti-terrorism statute makes the platforms liable for hosting ISIS's speech and for the real-world harms that they say were caused by that speech. They also argue that the platforms shouldn't be permitted to invoke the immunity statute that they would otherwise be able to invoke, that's Section 230, because the platforms knew that they were hosting ISIS's speech, and because they didn't merely host the speech, but also through their algorithms recommended it. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but the questions presented by these two cases, Gonzalez and Tamna, are a really big deal. For a quarter century, the platforms have relied on lower court rulings that allowed them to host user speech without having to worry that they could be held civilly liable. Now there's the very real possibility that the Supreme Court will read Section 230 more narrowly, and that the platforms will lose some of the immunity that they have relied on until now. What would happen if they did? Well, the platforms might be more zealous about taking down the kind of content that the plaintiffs highlight in Gonzalez and Tamna, content posted by terrorist organizations. But with the threat of legal liability hanging over their heads, they'd certainly take down a lot of other speech too, including speech that is socially valuable. I wonder whether the Me Too movement, for example, could have got off the ground in a legal context in which platforms could be held civilly liable for the speech of their users. The questions presented by the net choice cases are, if anything, even more momentous. Again, these cases involve challenges to social media laws enacted recently by Texas and Florida. The laws restrict social media companies' authority to take down speech posted on their platforms and require them to make far-reaching public disclosures about their content moderation policies and decisions. One question in these cases is whether the social media companies exercise editorial judgment when they decide what content can and can't be posted on their platforms. That question is important because editorial judgment is protected by the First Amendment. The US Supreme Court has held in the past that newspapers exercise editorial judgment when they decide what to publish and what not to publish in their pages. And it's held that parade organizers exercise editorial judgment when they decide which floats to allow in their parade. Now the social media platforms are arguing that they exercise editorial judgment when they decide what content will appear on their platforms. On the other side, Florida and Texas contend that the platforms are not expressive actors at all, that they're akin to common carriers with no First Amendment rights to speak of. A second question in the net choice cases is what it means if the platforms are exercising editorial judgment. Does it mean they can't be regulated at all, as the platforms argue? Or are there some kinds of regulations that might be constitutional, even if the platform's content moderation policies are protected by the First Amendment? That's a big deal question too, because the answer to it determines how much regulatory latitude legislatures in the United States will have. I'm not going to pretend that I know the answers to these questions. The questions are genuinely hard. One reason they're hard, and I'll close with this point, is that there are perils on both sides. On one side, there's the danger of unrestrained government power, of investing public officials with broad or broader authority to distort, constrain, and censor public discourse. The risks here are real. All around the world today, governments are using laws that criminalize fake news to persecute their political opponents and suppress legitimate dissent. If the Trump administration had had misinformation laws available to it, you can be confident that those laws would have been used in similar ways. The Florida and Texas statutes, which were enacted by Republican legislatures intent on retaliating against platforms that deplatform Trump, are themselves a kind of warning about the ways in which new censorial power is likely to be deployed. But on the other side, of course, there's the power of the platforms themselves. A small number of private companies have acquired immense influence over the expressive spaces that are most important to our democracies. In the digital public sphere, they decide who can speak, which ideas get heard, and perhaps most important, which ideas get traction. The consolidation of editorial power in the hands of a small number of technology companies whose interests are not at all aligned with those of their users, let alone with the interests of the democratic public, also poses a substantial and urgent threat to our societies. Caught between these two perils of unrestrained public power on one side and unaccountable private power on the other, what can we do to ensure that our digital public sphere better serves democracy? Are there regulatory interventions that would promote rather than undermine self-government? The most promising proposals, in my view, are ones that are structural in nature. Transparency mandates, interoperability mandates, due process safeguards, antitrust, new restrictions on what data platforms can collect and how they can use it, new protections for journalists and researchers who study the platforms. There are risks even here, because even structural and content-neutral rules can be used in discriminatory and retaliatory ways. But it seems to me that structural interventions like these, if crafted carefully, would be the best way to reconnect the digital public sphere with the democratic values we need it to serve. Thanks again to Taylor and his team for the invitation. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Jameel?
Oh, can you hear me? Oh, they're much better. I'm going to set a timer so I don't monologue for too long. Because I'll get enthusiastic, and then I'll be like, oh no, 20 minutes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I've had a really amazing couple days in Canada, in Ottawa, talking to a variety of cabinet ministers around online safety. And it's really exciting where Canada is standing today. So if I had to choose which side of the border to be standing in right now in terms of progress on these two issues, I think you're actually in a really good place from the perspective of Jameel is completely right. These are really complicated issues. Like, we have a lot of, I would call it intellectual inertia in how we think about these problems and how we think about solving these problems. And a lot of that is playing out, I think, in really dangerous ways in the United States. So I am really sad that the Supreme Court took up the cases that it did, because it is very unlikely that the Supreme Court is going to thread the needle on how to proceed forward in a way that is actually not going to cause potentially huge consequences in either direction, right? So on one side, I completely agree about this issue around over-enforcement. When we think about how to deal with social media, it is totally intuitive, and it's obvious that the thing that you see on your phones, that seems like the product, right? When you see something that looks like it shouldn't be there, it's harmful to another person, it's offensive to you, it's hurtful to you, you're like, oh, well, the solution is to take that thing off, or that thing shouldn't be there. So there's kind of three ways you can write these laws. So one way of writing these laws is you can say, you are not allowed to have XYZ kind of content. Or if there's even one piece of terrorism content, that's a fine. Or you're responsible for every last eating disorder thing that goes up there. And the challenge with those laws, and I think you hinted at this, is that we lack the technology today, and we will likely lack the technology for at least 20 or 30 years to effectively and precisely identify all of a class of content. So when we talk about things like hate speech requires a huge amount of context. You can have a sentence that's very similar to another sentence, and one will be hateful and another one won't be. Or incitement to violence. You have two paragraphs that are very similar, and one has a dog whistle around violence and one doesn't. When you are trying to write artificial intelligence to identify and take down content, you're always forced to do a trade-off between precision and recall. So do you want to get every last bad piece of content, but accept they're going to take down some good content in the process? Or do you want to not sacrifice good content, but trade that off with not getting all of the bad content? In the case of hate speech, because there is so much context, teams of some of the world's best experts in how to classify language at Facebook, they were able to get systems that even accepting 10% errors, so that's a lot of good content being taken down as well, they could only take down 3 to 5% of hate speech. Facebook's internal researchers said, even with tons more investment, the best we're going to get to is 10 to 20% of content. In a world where Facebook is responsible for every last piece of ISIS content, you end up in a situation where you're going to take down every explainer video about ISIS. You're going to take down counter speech about ISIS. At Facebook, the documents say very clearly 75% of counterterrorism content in Arabic was getting labeled as terrorist content and taken down. we should expect to see those harms over and over and over again if we write laws or have Supreme Court judgments to say you are liable for every last piece of content. So what's the alternative? Canada has a really interesting draft bill that's going to come up in, I think, the spring, that focuses instead on the idea that right now we don't get to have a two-way conversation with the platforms. The civil society groups, parents, governments, mental health professionals go to the platforms and they say, we have problems. And the platforms go, maybe. That's anecdotal though, it's not representative. We don't have any rights to get data. We have no rights to see behind the curtain. We have no rights to understand what choices were made or why they were made. When we talk about things like cars, if we rolled back in time to 1965 in the United States, very, very few cars had seatbelts. We'd had seatbelts in some cars for about 20 years, but there were a wide range of really simple interventions that could drive down the death rate. Like, the auto companies knew about them, but they chose not to put them in their cars because they believed they couldn't drive additional sales with them. And that if they talked about safety, it would scare away consumers. Like, none of the other auto manufacturers were talking about safety. So if whoever was the first mover, it might scare away people. And Ralph Nader was able to access 100 pending court cases about a car called the Corvair. And in the process, he was looking through these things, and these are simple things like, our steering wheels today collapse when there's an auto accident. The reason for that is people used to be impaled on their steering columns. This is a change that, because it's just about how do you construct the steering column, it's functionally free. It's a question of, did you design this way? Did you design it that way? When that book came out, when for the first time that whole set of options was laid out in front of people, people got really angry. They said, wait, you had all these different ways you could have saved lives, but you didn't do them because you thought they would scare away customers. And the next year we got the Department of Transportation. 2 years after that, we got the first law saying every car has to have a seatbelt. Today, the fatality rate for cars is 3.5 times lower than it was back then on a per mile driven. In terms of incremental lives saved in just the United States alone, that's equal to about 2.5 times as many people as die of breast cancer every year in extra supplemental deaths. Like, think about how hard we fight breast cancer. Like, we can get better things, but we have to work for them. The thing I want to hit on before we kind of transition in is I don't think inaction is sufficient. So I think a lot about rule of law. So the ultimate thing that protects freedom of speech is rule of law, right? If we don't believe in rights, if we don't believe in having, due process, very rapid, we also lose the ability to have freedom of speech. The thing that we are seeing around the world is a rise in populist, undemocratic movements that are often xenophobic, that are often authoritarian. And the thing that I'm scared of is us not acting out of fear of having the government get involved and paying the cost of losing our rights in the process. We can have processes that don't touch on speech itself. We can have things where we say, hey, remember how Ralph Nader was able to look through those court cases and understand what were the tools available? Imagine if there was a law, and this is in the bill that's being proposed, social media companies had to disclose the risks they knew about. So it wasn't a thing of us asking, hey, what's the deal with mental health in kids, which the Senate did in the United States a month before I came out. And Facebook responded back with a 6-page letter saying, we don't have to give you anything, even though they had tons of internal documents about kids saying things like, children use an addict's narrative to describe their usage. They say, this makes me miserable, I can't stop using it. If I leave, I'll be ostracized. They knew this was in their documents, but they didn't give it. Imagine a world where we didn't pass laws saying you cannot have a single piece of terrorism content. You can't have a single piece of hate speech. But we did say, hey, you need to explain to us what the risks, how are your products contributing to spreading terrorism? A key part in Gonzalez that I do agree with, most of Gonzalez, I'm please just stay away from that. This is not gonna end well in either direction. You should have just waited a little bit. Is they said, people saw these videos who would not have seen them if Google hadn't figured out who would most likely like them. So they looked in the general population and said, who might really enjoy watching an ISIS recruitment video? And then they sent that video to that person. When we wrote Section 230 in 1996, nowhere in the world, other than a few academic labs, were there things called recommender systems. So a recommender system is different than a search engine. So we've had search engines since the 70s. A search engine, you say, could I have an ISIS video? And it goes and it looks through all the videos and says, this ISIS video is for you. A recommender system says, hey, we have a giant stack of videos. We have hundreds of millions of videos. I just want to see 4. What should I watch next? And it looks through there and it makes some guesses and it shows some things that you might like. The first recommender system that was commercially viable was from Amazon in 1999. It's like you bought this, you might buy like that. The first algorithmic feed that was like a consumer passive feed that was major was Facebook's in 2011. Twitter didn't have one until 2016. So 15 years, 20 years after this law passed. We have to start talking about the choices that went into those systems because they are going out and finding people who are vulnerable to content. They are going out and finding kids who are susceptible to depression and then giving those kids more self-harm glorifying content. They are going out to kids that are susceptible to eating disorders and sending those things. I don't think we can continue on our vector indefinitely in terms of waiting for something to happen because it will just keep getting worse. But we also can't do knee-jerk things like what I'm afraid the Supreme Court's gonna do, where they're gonna come out and say, you know, now we can have a zillion product liability suits because someone saw one ISIS video. So we'll see.
All right, thank you both. So I wanted to get into a number of aspects of this. It's actually a little hard to know where to start. We covered so much ground there. And I want to get into the policy conversation in a minute. But first, Jameel, I want to push you a bit on the debates that are happening around free speech and the legal entitlements and the legal framework in which platforms are allowed to function in the United States and their global nature. So you've been studying free speech for, dare I say, longer than social media for sure. I won't go as far as the internet because I don't want to sort of, pigeonhole you. And the internet probably, yeah. But we don't need to get into that. So you're also Canadian, and we don't have a First Amendment. We have a charter. And Germany has very strict hate speech laws. And France has a whole different legal regime for speech. And yet they all use the same platforms. And the laws you're talking about, and these very critical Supreme Court decisions, are going to shape the speech of citizens in other democratic countries who have different norms and laws for speech. That's right. So as someone who studies free speech, how do you think about that problem?
Well, okay, so a couple things. First, the First Amendment, I think, in this context, as it has been interpreted by U.S. courts, is a blessing and a burden. On one hand, it centers this conversation it requires a conversation in the United States about the free speech implications of policy or proposed policy interventions. And that is a very important conversation to have because there's no right that's more intimately connected with democracy than free speech. And thinking through what are the implications for free speech is thinking through what are the implications for democracy. I think that is a crucial conversation. And the First Amendment forces us to have that conversation in a kind of rigorous way because you have to have it not just in the public sphere, but in court where somebody's offering the counter to your position all the time, right? I also think that there is a broad, or at least until very recently, there has been a broad societal appreciation in the United States for the value of free speech. I think there still is now. What's changed over the last few years is, I alluded to some of this earlier, but the culture war, or the kind of strange evolution of this policy conversation into a broader cultural conversation. But I think part of the reason the conversation is broken down in the United States is that the questions around free speech on social media are actually really, really complicated. And that's in part because you're no longer talking about a single threat. Like, you're no longer talking about, like, if you look back at old Supreme Court cases, the paradigm was there's a government actor who is censoring a private individual's speech. That's the paradigm, right? Somebody wants to leaflet to distribute leaflets against the war, and a government actor wants to suppress that speech. That's the paradigmatic case. And if you look at old Supreme Court cases all the way through the 1970s and 80s, that's the kind of case that's the paradigm that's in the background all the time. That's the model that judges have. Online, it's actually much more complicated than that, because you have these intermediaries like social media platforms. They're not the only intermediaries, but they're our focus tonight. So social media companies are intermediaries. They have their own, whether you want to call it editorial judgment or not, they have their own expressive interests, right? In the same way that the New York Times, which is a for-profit corporation, has an expressive interest. You have to figure out how to weigh that expressive interest against the expressive interest of users who are using that platform, and against the interests that the government is asserting, which are often quite compelling. The government says we want to suppress child sexual abuse images, or we want to ensure that terrorists don't recruit people to their cause. And those are weighty interests. But now, instead of having this very simple model of a government censoring an individual citizen, you have what some scholars have referred to as a triangle, where you have social media platforms, you have the government, and you have the users. And our inherited case law, and even beyond that, our kind of way of thinking about free speech, doesn't map on to the situation we find ourselves in now. And we really are still struggling to figure out how to talk about free speech in this very different factual context, where you have not just the threat of government censorship, but you have the threat of private actors who, from one particular vantage point, are engaged in a kind of censorship, and that's certainly the way that Florida and Texas see it, and from another standpoint, are actually engaged in expressive activity themselves, which deserves protection against censorship. So it's a lot more complicated now than it was in the previous paradigm, and I certainly haven't figured it out, but I would venture to say that nobody else out there has figured it out either. And yet, as Francis says, there are very real harms to the world that are taking place, right now, and it doesn't seem like it's open to us just to wait around until somebody figures it all out.
I think there's some contexts where, like, we keep looking at social media and thinking it's like a blog. And when we look at blogs, we're like, oh, that's like a newspaper. Like, we have these, like, we always try to apply mental models of things we used to understand, like the new things. And, a key difference between a newspaper and social media is, like, in a newspaper, who writes it. They usually publish their editorial policies. They usually publish who owns it. Like, you have a general sense of, like, whose opinion is directing the editorial judgment. And in the case of social media, because all we see is our own screens, like, you can imagine a world where, what if I actually could show you 1,000 random samples, like 1,000 random posts, and say, this is kind of representative of what's being created. And then I showed you another 1,000 posts where I said, if a post gets seen 1 million times, it's gonna be 1 million times as likely to show up in this data set than if it got seen once. So now this new set of 1,000 posts is representative of what's being seen. So we saw what was created, and then what got delivered. Right, this isn't email, right? Like, if we were talking about email, and I send an email to you, it shows up in your inbox. You may choose not to read it. You might not do inbox 0, but you get exactly what was sent to you. If we compared those two things, they're not the same. There's lots and lots of opinions missing in what got delivered than what got created. And right now, we never get to make choices about that divide. We get to hear stories about objectivity, or, like, we're doing what's best for the user. But we never actually get a chance to compare what happens on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. And there's major implications for those editorial judgments that are being made. And so we have to start thinking about new frameworks that allow us to place incentives or make real choices in a context like that.
So I think, Jameel, you framed some of the legal apparatus that shapes the character of the intermediaries. And one of the ways these intermediaries determine the character of our speech and our free expression is the way they're designed, like you just articulated. But the other way they shape speech is through their own rules and how they adjudicate the speech of their users. And one of the most striking things I've seen in your documents and how they've been reported is this discrepancy between where content moderation resources are allocated. And that 87% of the budget for content moderation goes to American content, when 8% of users are, I may have my numbers a little off, 8%, 10% of the users are American. So some radical discrepancy in where and how speech is controlled and moderated by the private entities that we've allocated the right to do that. How do you talk about free speech in that context?
Can we do a misinfo check first, though? So 87% of the misinfo operational budget went to English versus 8 to 9% of users. There are many other harm categories like brand safety, where the dollars get allocated basically where the people are. So it really depends on what kind of content moderation we're talking about.
Yeah.
But your point is right.
I mean, it also goes back to a question you asked me and I didn't answer, Taylor, which is about how I feel about American platforms dictating these rules that have such a profound effect on. I mean, the short answer is I don't feel very good about it. I mean, I think that it makes sense for other democracies to assert their sovereignty over their own digital public spheres. It makes no sense to turn over to Facebook or TikTok or Google or any of these companies the authority to decide questions that are so foundational to self-government. Canadians have to figure out what Canadians want their society to look like, and part of that is asserting ownership over the digital public sphere. So I'm glad that there's this conversation in Canada now about what asserting ownership over the digital public sphere looks like. Like I said, I think it's a really hard thing to figure out, but I don't see a way around it.
Francis, you talked about a linguistic inequity that emerges from this disproportionate allocation of resources, whether for misinformation or for content moderation in different countries. Can you describe how that sort of character of what is allowed to be said and how safe these spaces are in different countries and different languages?
So I always like to talk about incentives, right? So the reason why I keep coming back to being like, let's talk about process, let's talk about incentives, which sounds boring, I know. It's not as exciting as like, let's take down the terrorists. But it helps us unpack like why did we get systems that are so inequitable, right? So that 87 number, like why would it be that we do 8 or 9% of the brand safety budget to English, but we do 87% of the misinfo operational budget to English? And that's because Facebook is an American company. Like they allocate their safety dollars based on fear of intervention, not based on need. And one of the ways those inequalities play out, and like why I came forward, was I wasn't aware of this before I joined Facebook. So if this comes as a surprise, don't feel bad. I'm pretty well read. I was just blown away. Facebook went in some of the most vulnerable places in the world and said, if you use Facebook or our products, your data is free. If you use anything on the open web, it's going to cost you. And because market incentives are real, in a lot of those countries, 30 or 40% of the population could only afford to use Facebook. And because 30 or 40% of the population couldn't do anything but Facebook, the internet converged in those countries onto Facebook. But because Facebook allocates their safety dollars based on fear of intervention and not based on actual need of the users, those same places, right? So there's now a shocking number of countries around the world where when you survey them, you say, do you use the internet? Do you use Facebook? There's a 10% margin higher for people who say, I use Facebook than say, I use the internet, because they're not even aware they're using the internet. Those same places often have no no safety systems. They might have very few content moderators that speak their local language. I'll give you an example. I was in Norway earlier this year, and a journalist came to me and said, we went to a Facebook comms person and said, here are 1,000 posts in Norwegian celebrating suicide and self-harm. You know, it's things like a black and white picture of train tracks and today is a great day to die, right? Stuff like that. And the comms person was like, we can't do anything about this. Like, you have to report them. And so they went back and they reported all 1,000 posts. They kept a spreadsheet and they went back and checked on it a couple months later. And all of them were still up. And I think the reason why is because there's only 5 million Norwegian speakers, right? It's a small language. It doesn't scale. So instead of designing for safety from the start, trying to reduce risks from the start, they tried to tack on AI in places where we could watch, in places where we might be able to make a difference, and then never told us where the blind spots were. So
I want to talk a little bit about the policy agenda that's emerging here. Francis, you mentioned that there's these sort of competing strategies. You can force companies to take down content that you decide is either illegal or unwanted in your society, or you can change the structural incentives of the system itself so that it prioritizes positive content and free expression and maybe minimizes the risk of the products. Jameel, when you've looked at these regimes in whether the Digital Services Act in Europe, the Online Safety Bill in the UK, potentially what the Commission proposed in Canada, how would you characterize that regime, and what concerns you still about it? Because it doesn't absolve all the issues you're raising.
Well, I mean, I think that there are the low-hanging fruit is transparency, right? Most of these regimes have significant transparency requirements. They require the platforms to share certain kinds of data with researchers. There's a bill in the United States right now that would protect journalists and researchers who would otherwise face criminal liability for using certain kinds of digital tools to study the platforms. All of that stuff seems to me really important, and there's not a lot on the other side of the balance there. It just seems like an easy thing to do, and would be a good in itself. The transparency would be a good in itself, but would also help us develop other regulatory proposals that might be better informed than the ones that are floating out there right now. The piece of it that I have concerns about is a kind of takedown regime, the regime that requires platforms to take down content that is unlawful. And the reason I have concerns about those kinds of regimes is that the platforms themselves have very little incentive to go to bat for any particular piece of content. They don't care about any particular piece of content. And if somebody comes to the platform and says, you have this piece of content up and I think it's unlawful, the platform's financial incentive is just to say, we'll take it down, right? They have no interest in having a fight over whether this content is or isn't unlawful. If it's anywhere close to the line, they will take it down. Then there are other categories. That's true even if the category of unlawful content is very well defined, right? Even if it's very well defined, stuff that's close to the line, the platforms will take down because it's just not in their interest to have those fights. It's just costly to have those fights, and they don't have a dog in the fight. But in a lot of cases, the categories of content that platforms are required to take down are themselves vague or poorly defined, and that's an additional problem with some of these regimes. And then there's also the concern that when the platforms are put in the position of having to take down these broad categories of content, in practice what happens is that the loudest voices outside the platforms, the loudest private groups, bring pressure to bear on the platforms to take down that content, and the platforms are responsive to those groups. And the result is that some of the content that is most uncomfortable for us, but still, but also most valuable to our society, so content that is telling us things we don't like, right? I'm not talking about content that celebrates terrorist attacks. I'm talking about political dissent that is uncomfortable for most of us to hear, because we think of it, and we might be right, we think of it as lunatic and dangerous and crazy and sort of undermining the cohesion of our society. That stuff is stuff that I think most needs to be protected, because if we're going to have a society that is capable of evolving, we need those kinds of voices, even if those kinds of voices are wrong 90% of the time. But it's those voices that are going to be most affected by over-enforcement of these kinds of regimes. That's what I worry about. Now, I don't think we want that concern to kind of be the tail that wags the dog. Like I'm not suggesting that every regime of this kind is should be viewed as categorically off the table. But I think it's a real concern, and I don't feel like it's a concern that has been fully given sufficient weight in some of these political processes.
Can I ask a clarification question? So I can't tell if we're talking across each other. So I 100% agree with you. Regimes where you say, this is prohibited content, you cannot have it, take it down immediately, you're liable. I 100% agree. Those are 100% bad laws, because you cannot actually do this with AI today, and you're not going to do it for the next 20 years. So if that's what you want, we should sit down and talk about computer science, because it's much harder than you think. But the thing I'm really curious about your opinion on, because I've been talking to Taylor too much, and I can't tell if we're drinking the same Kool-Aid, is what do you think about regulatory systems where you say hey, if you know there's dangers on your platform, you've got to tell us, straight up. We're not even talking about data transparency. We're hey, we know you've been asking questions, you've been doing research, kind of reading the tea leaves. You got to level with us. And you got to have a plan on how you're going to deal with that. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to get rid of every last piece, but you got to tell you your plan, and you got to give us enough data to know you're making progress. What can you give me? Can you?
I find it hard to respond to that at that level, because so there are two pieces of it. One is tell us what's on your platform. Tell us the risks or tell us what you know about the way people are using the platform and the harms that are resulting. I have no concerns about that. It sounds like a great idea. The second piece is, now you're required to do something about it. And there I have two questions. One is, what does required mean? And the other is, what is the it? Do something about what? If the it is, people are getting radicalized on the platform, I think that is way too vague a standard to hold the platforms to. And I say that because the reason I think we should care about that is that if the platforms are held to those kinds of standards, they have every incentive to respond just by taking the speech down. And again, I think some of the speech is socially valuable, including some of the speech that most of us don't like to see. I mean, I remember at the beginning of the pandemic when when we were first asked to wear masks, and I would walk out on the street and I'd see people who weren't wearing masks, and I would see people on social media undermining the message that masks are useful and protective, and I would get very angry at that. I just felt like that is speech that is causing real harms in the world. In retrospect, I actually think that a lot of those voices were necessary. I think a lot of those voices forced us to ask ourselves as a society, first, what do we mean when we say masks are protective? In what ways are they protective? Are they more protective, more necessary for some groups than others? What are the trade-offs? And I still wear a mask on public transport and on the plane, and I look at other people who aren't wearing masks, and I think, well, maybe you ought to wear a mask. But I have a different appreciation now for that, speech that made me very uncomfortable, a couple of years ago. That's a very small example. But I think that kind of speech is the kind of speech that will be taken down. And we're arguing, well, I don't know if we're arguing, but we're talking at a level of generality that makes it, I think, difficult to.
I guess part of the reason why I'm trying to push you on it is when part of what I worry about a ton is that the platforms have spent hundreds of millions of dollars, literally hundreds of millions of dollars, telling us the only way to be safe is content moderation. That the only way to be safe is to take the stuff down. And even when I hear you talking about the masks thing, the fundamental issue for me on the masks thing is that there were 100 posts about masks, and the most extreme 10 on either side were the only ones that got distributed. And the boring person who diligently wrote up 16 studies and did this long wall of text didn't get distributed. And so I guess one thing is we can talk about how you word laws like that to say you need to tell about your role in spreading that content, or your role in shaping that conversation, versus saying the role industry specific.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that kind of transparency, which is for reasons you just sort of alluded to, kind of difficult to articulate precisely what that transparency would look like, but that's the kind of transparency we need, right? We need to know what is the role these platforms are playing in shaping or distorting public discourse. And that seems to me the most crucial piece of the transparency menu.
Because I want to get on side with you, because there's a bunch of stuff we really, really agree on. So the thing that breaks my heart, so beyond the fact that I do get to hear a lot about tragedies, the second top thing that breaks my heart is I work with a lot of civil society people around the world. And I have now heard from activists in at least 4 or 5 countries, because we've done a bunch of these big civil society briefings, where basically every woman who works on violence against women has had their account taken off Facebook. Or every gay activist who's come to one of these things has had their account taken off Facebook. And they'll be my whole team has had their accounts taken off Facebook. And it's because counter speech and violating speech look really, really similar.
Right, I want to leave some time for everybody, so please get questions ready if you have them. But I want to ask one more broader question. That we're having this conversation in a democratic country that has laws over speech that we broadly consent to as citizens. That's true in the United States as well. If I'm in a liberal-leaning regime, leave aside fully autocratic regimes where there's full control over our technologies and speech. But if I'm just in a liberal-leaning regime, it's very possible I would prefer the terms of service over speech that platforms provide me than the laws my government are imposing on my speech. Should that be a consideration when we're making our own laws? Should we take the interests of those citizens into account and maybe align ours a little bit more with the platform so that everybody gets a little bit more speech rather than us getting our perfect version of it in our far safer context?
Is it really true that the decisions that Canadians made about that question would have an effect on? I mean, I think in India, there's a kind of lowest common denominator problem. I mean, it may be that Twitter wants to give Indian activists more latitude, but at the end of the day, it's the Indian government that gets to decide how much latitude they have, right?
It is, but the default is to generalize their policies across all users until a government imposes a significant enough counterforce to make them change that behavior, right?
That's true. I mean, I guess the question is how strong that default position is. I mean, in the kinds of countries that I'd be most worried about, I wonder how much work that default actually does. I mean, that default is not doing that much work in India right now, I would say.
For context, as like a concrete example, like one of the things that came out in the disclosures was that the Vietnamese government put a lot of pressure on Facebook to go after the political opposition. And Facebook, given that the Vietnamese government slowed Facebook down in retaliation when they first said no, ended up going and just taking out the opposition.
Can we open up to some questions here? Helen, I think you have the microphone, so if anybody has a question. Now's your chance.
Hi. Can hear me. Can the social media platforms operate responsibly in a world where we're living in the age of surveillance capitalism, where attention span, the main resource is our attention, like that's the product. Can they act responsibly, in this world?
I guess I'll take that one. So there are questions around like, can we have successful business models for social media platforms that didn't do surveillance capitalism? I think that's probably true. Like, it's all a question of like, how profitable do you want these companies to be, right? And like, Facebook is insanely profitable for its scale. There's very few companies that are hundreds of billions of dollars in value and still have 35% profit margins. So almost certainly you could be doing something that was more bare bones that wasn't quite so extractive. I think the secondary question, though, is almost every single thing around surveillance capitalism still says you can't consent to let other people use your data. It's not saying like we can never have products ever again that can use data. It's more of a thing like, should people be allowed to control when they give up their data? And it's really important for us to remember that algorithmic feeds are pleasurable. Like, part of why I always chafe a little bit when people are like, we just need antitrust laws and that's gonna fix everything. Let the market decide. I'm like, the issue here is that engagement-based ranking, these algorithmic feeds, take people and they keep pushing them up a path of extremism. And that could be from healthy eating to anorexia. That could be from center left to like, let's kill Republicans. I mean, like, it really is that dramatic. The problem is that if you say to someone, do you want a chronological feed or do you want a perfectly tuned to you feed? A remarkably high fraction of people are going to say this is more pleasurable. I'm going to do that. So I think this question of can they operate without doing surveillance capitalism? Almost certainly. Would people choose that voluntarily? I'm not sure.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My question for, I think, Jameel more, is, do you think that the focus on regulating platforms is a retrenchment to the least politically costly solution? So hate speech is legal in the US, right? So why are we expecting companies to regulate speech that the government itself is unwilling to regulate? And I wonder, for example, if the Supreme Court cases didn't have ISIS terrorism content in the lawsuit, but rather January 6th insurrection, would they have been taken up? Would the final decisions be similar, right? The issue of what hate speech is also kind of content neutral, but the law doesn't seem to, or justice doesn't seem to apply neutrally to marginalized groups on the left or reactive groups on the right.
Really great questions. I do think that the case would probably be received very differently by this Supreme Court if it were a January 6th case rather than an ISIS case. That said, I think it's difficult to predict what this court will do with these cases. Justice Clarence Thomas, who is on the far right on the court, has already said that he thinks Section 230 should be interpreted much more narrowly, so we know where he's going to come out on at least one of these cases. And I think that he will likely sign on to the view that the social media platforms are effectively common carriers or can be regulated like common carriers. So he'll probably vote to uphold the Florida and Texas laws. But once you get past Justice Thomas, it's pretty difficult to predict where the justices are going to come out. The right is split. There's a kind of libertarian right on the court, which cares a lot about property rights, and I think their instinct is likely to be that these private companies should get to decide for themselves what they carry on their platforms. And then there's a kind of more cultural right, which Justice Thomas is probably the leader of on the court, which is really worried about the influence that these platforms, in his view, are having over public discourse in the country. And then on the left, I really don't know what Justice Sotomayor, for example, how she's going to approach these cases. So, I mean, I think that there are justices on the right who would have seen this case differently if it were a January 6th case, but the fact that it's an ISIS case doesn't make me feel like I know how it's going to come out. Your other question is a much bigger question than I feel like I can answer, but just one observation about it. You're right that we are asking the social media platforms to censor speech that the government itself, couldn't censor if it wanted to. One question I think is useful to ask is the reason that the government in the United States can't censor these categories of speech is that collectively we came to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, collectively we came to the conclusion that however bad that speech is, it would be worse to give the government the power to suppress it, that speech has some kind of social value, or at least the censorship of that speech would be socially problematic. That's 100 years of free speech history in the United States that led to that conclusion. And now all of our speech takes place, or a lot of our speech takes place on these platforms where the constraints, the sort of parameters on public discourse are much narrower. And one question to ask is, is there some loss to our democracy if these platforms constrain public discourse in that way? I think, the Florida and Texas laws are motivated by many things, and some of them not good. But there is one insight that I'm not unsympathetic to, in those laws, or one motivation that I'm not unsympathetic to. I think that some of the people behind those laws feel that public discourse is being constrained by private actors, and that is going to have it's going to undermine the strength of public discourse that's necessary to democracy. I think that's a really I think that motivation is one that people across the political spectrum should understand.
Actually, can I touch on one thing real quick? So again, that question presumed that the solution on hate speech is to take the hate speech down. It's not a question of, there were 100 posts and 3 of the posts had hate speech in them, and for some reason the only posts we distributed were the 3 hate speech ones. And one of the things we also see, and this is really sad, is that these systems, they model your interests based on how you interact with them. And a thing that we've had reported from activists is, I went and put a comment on this guy's post to explain to him why this is hate speech, and I now get more hate speech in my feed, right? When you open Facebook or Instagram, they get 100,000 posts they could show you, and they have to choose 10, right? So I don't want us to fall into the frame of reference that the tech companies have pushed out, that the only thing to discuss is content moderation.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think we saw a kind of a high profile episode involving precisely this, this misperception with Trump's deplatforming, where Facebook tried to make the debate about a content moderation decision. The question is, do we allow Trump to have his account or don't we? When in fact, a lot of the damage done by Trump's account was done not by the account itself, but by Facebook's algorithmic and engineering decisions that resulted in the Trump developing the profile on the platform that he did, Twitter too. So I absolutely agree that there should be more focus on sort of algorithmic amplification and recommendation engines and maybe a little bit less focus on the on or off content moderation decisions.
And I actually want to back up the Texans. Like, I think the Texans have a really good grain of concern, which is they say, you should have to publish how these things work, right? Because right now, Facebook will say things like, well, only 3% of content is now political on Facebook. Like, we are intentionally not showing as much of it in the platform. What does that even mean? Like, when is something political or not political? Like, why do you get to decide that? And so a lot of these things, at a minimum, if you're afraid of being censored, at a minimum, push for laws that let us actually get to inspect the systems of censorship.
The irony is that conservatives think they're being censored and liberals think the conservatives are being amplified. And they can't both be right.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that insightful and great discussion so far. So my question is around within Facebook Meta. Francis, can you shed some light on the internal debates and how issues are being framed, and why these are the decisions that are being made, and the question around the democratic processes within a workplace where you as an employee have a certain concern, you took the route that you did. However, there must be many views within this company. Can you talk about the type of narratives and tensions and contestations, and also the role of voice to actually, within the company, to actually say, hey, maybe these documents are showing us something that we should be listening to, versus what actually we're seeing, right? So can you shed some light in the internal culture? I don't know if it's a culture issue, or is it a democratic process that workers have very little power?
I think those are both true, but I think it's really important to break out. There's a different culture in Facebook, like Facebook Blue, in WhatsApp, and in Instagram. Like, they were founded by different groups of people, they existed independently for different amounts of time, and they've retained slightly different cultures. I think the core problem with Facebook Blue is that it has a culture that believes, like, it fetishizes flatness. Like, if you were to talk to them, they say, we're hyper-democratic inside of Facebook. Like, we don't believe there should be people who should be able to say, I don't think your idea is good. Instead, there should be a free marketplace of ideas, and we should have standardized goalposts. And if you move the ball the furthest down the line, your thing should win. And the only problem with that system, and to give you a sense of how much they fetishize flatness, they built the largest open floor plan office in the world. It's 1/4 of a mile long. It seats 5,000 people. It became useless during COVID. It literally is an aircraft hangar. Like, the floor is not even perfectly flat. So I used to fall all the time. I mean, it's a cult. But not that I was frustrated with this building. I was also really cold. I mean, there's a bunch of issues. But they're so obsessed with the idea that they can let people do anything, that they're a startup, and that they're objective. And it means that they can't acknowledge that every single simplification, every system of abstraction, when you say, we have goalposts, these are our metrics, as long as the metrics go up, it's good, that certain things are biased towards or against under that metric scheme. And that worked really, really well at Facebook for a long time. And then in 2018, they shifted over from time spent, so basically optimizing for your happiness, to optimizing for your role in the ecosystem. So they found that the only way to get people to produce more content is if they got more interaction, more likes, more comments, more reshares. Like, your job became to give dopamine to your friends so they would keep making more content. And unfortunately, when they switched over to that regime, almost immediately political parties on the right and the left across Europe started saying, we're having to run more extreme ideas to get distributed. Like, it used to be we could put out a white paper on our agricultural policy, And it's not like I got the most comments, but like we could look in the stats, like people spend time with it. Like people read it. If we sent out the same thing today, it's crickets. But because inside the company now there were literally thousands of people whose bonuses relied on this metric going up, it was hard to go and change that regime, especially when they needed that engagement to get people to produce more content. Inside of WhatsApp, because they can't see what happens, it's encrypted, they spend a lot more time thinking through, if we do X, what do we logically think will happen? Like, let's go and stress test that. Maybe we'll even go interview people. Like, let's try to have a theory of change, not just metric go up. And you make different decisions. So like that was a huge part of what happened inside of Facebook, was that the system of management devalued human perspective, and it devalued leadership in actually coming in and saying, the system is broken. Like there wasn't a space for that.
So we all know how hard it is for governments to actually pass bills and legislation
Do you know that?
these days. A little bit. So here's what keeps
Easier in Canada than the United States.
here's what keeps me up at night. How do we make sure we're not fixing just today's problem? Is that in 3, 4, 5 years, when the metaverse blows up, when Web 3 blows up, how do we not repeat the mistakes of Web 2? How do we build policies right now? Because we're not going to get 50 kicks at the can at this. How do we make sure that what the government does now is sustainable for long term? Because even if we pass a bill, it's going to take a while to implement. And by the time it gets implemented, maybe the problems are different. So what's your advice
How
on
do you
that?
future-proof this?
So I can take this one, but Taylor, you're the, okay, let's say. Taylor's like the expert of this one, but I'll regurgitate what the variety
I'm the
of policy people
moderator,
take.
yeah.
Okay. So there's really a third, we talked about you can have laws that say you may not have X. And we said there's laws where you say, hey, you need to disclose how you're doing things, and you got to have a plan on how you're going to get better at them, and you got to show us you're doing that. There's actually a third one, which is you say, you may not do X, Y, Z, which is kind of a cousin of you can't have X. Those kinds of laws, you're totally right, are not future-proof, right? Big tech companies are very good at figuring out exactly where the fence is and then running around the edge of the fence. And I think one of the things that I'm really excited about the Digital Services Act, which is the law, one of the laws that the online safety bill in Canada is modeled off of. One of the things I really like about it is that it's about risk assessments. It says if you're an online platform and you're bigger than a certain size, you impact more than a certain fraction of our citizens, you need to go through this process with us, and you need to come talk to us every 6 months, because you're right, even a single product will be a different product over time. If we had Facebook of 2008, how many people in here remember Facebook of 2008? Come on, don't make me feel old. Yeah, okay. So once upon a time, Facebook was about your family and friends. If along the way, Facebook had to publish a bunch of data on the harms on their platform, they likely would not have shifted into this mega groups hypervirality machine to the same extent that they have. When we look at things like the metaverse, if we talk about these things in terms of social platforms, instead of talking about them in terms of social media, then we can begin to say the same things like, hey, regarding the metaverse, what do you think the risks are? What's your plan for that? What data are you going to give us? And one of the things I actually am not aware if it's in this law, but we should have a conversation on, is Facebook is shifting to the metaverse because they don't want supply chain responsibility. Like they're shifting to it because they want someone who comes to them and says, this horrible thing happened to me. They want to be able to say, I'm so sorry, that sounds horrible, but we didn't write that program. We just made the hardware. And you're totally right. If we want to be able to be future-proofing things, we need to say, if you are driving these actions in the world, it doesn't matter if you're just making the hardware, you're still responsible.
So when Facebook launched Horizons, their first metaverse social product, they weren't mandated to have to do risk assessments. And in the first days they launched it,
So they claimed they were doing it.
right, women started getting abused and groped inside virtual reality, inside the social system. So this was a problem. There were journalistic stories made about it, so there was some accountability on it. So they then instituted a 8-foot or 4-foot barrier around each of their virtual reality characters. So you can imagine a world in which risk assessments were mandatory, that potential risk might have been flagged and mitigated before the product was launched. So I think there are some ways we can get at future technologies just through this lens of risk.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those things, like part of the point of doing risk assessments is it's an opportunity to encourage platforms to talk to people beforehand, right? So if they had gone and just said, hey, who are the people who complain about Facebook? What if we just went around and had one conversation with each of those groups and said, hey, people who work on racial issues, what do you think is going to happen? People are going to say racial epithets to people. Guess what happened on Horizons? People were like, there's 40 people in this room. I know someone's whispering in my ear and saying these racist things to me, and I don't know who it is. Like, someone would have flagged that if they had talked to anyone about this in advance, right?
Another technology that sort of doesn't always get put in another platform that doesn't get always put in these conversations is TikTok at the moment. And I wonder how you both think. Jameel, how do you think the US government's going to deal with TikTok in the short term? And Francis, how do you view what TikTok is in a different way than some of the other platforms?
I just want to add one thing to the previous exchange, which is another way to future-proof these kinds of laws is to empower regulators, within broad parameters. You just give regulators enough guidance that the laws can be enforced, but not such granular guidance that the laws will be obsolete tomorrow. Now, I don't know enough about the Canadian landscape to know, whether or to what extent that makes sense here. In the United States, like one of the conversations we've been having is about who would enforce these transparency mandates and what do the transparency mandates look like. Same question, whatever transparency mandates might make sense today, tomorrow we're going to need something very different. So the best proposals, I think, in the US right now would empower the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, to enforce those kind of to spell out precisely what kinds of transparency are necessary, and to change that list, as technology evolves. On TikTok, I don't know the answer. I think that this is actually a bigger question that is probably 3 years from now going to be the subject of another Supreme Court in the US, because one good thing about the First Amendment in the United States is that the courts have recognized a listener interest, a constitutional interest that inheres in listeners. So if the government shuts down a foreign media organization, American citizens and residents can go to court and challenge that decision on the theory that the suppression of that foreign media organization has implications for their own constitutional rights to listen. And how that interacts with these very real questions about the countries asserting their own sovereignty over the digital public sphere, I think that's something that is only starting to get thought about in the United States. I think it will lead to some litigation very soon, but it hasn't yet.
One of the things I'm super concerned about TikTok is, just for context for people look at social media and they're kind of like, oh, it's all social media. It's about my family and friends, or it's about people who are interesting. The first time I opened TikTok, I was like, oh, this is clearly authoritarian, right? And I've worked on 4 social media platforms, and you can be like, how Francis, would you just look at it and like play around with it a little bit and be like, oh, TikTok has no promises to you, right? Like when you go on Instagram, for a long time, Instagram was like you followed people and you got stuff from them. Like that was the primary focus of Instagram. Or Facebook used to be about your family and friends. You get stuff from people you followed. Or you join groups and you get content from those groups. There's promises about like what you receive. TikTok doesn't make you promises. The only promise it makes you is you're gonna keep swiping. They're like, we're gonna convince you wanna watch another video. That's our only promise. And they do some things very intentionally for their own goals that come out of a context of control, right? So on Facebook, there's a great deal of concentration of voice. So in 2019, in the United States, it was probably not as good in Canada, which is a tangent, which we don't need to go into, but 12% of people got 80% of voice. And that was the most little d democratic country in the world. There were countries in the world where 1 or 2% of people got 80% of voice. TikTok is even more extreme than that. So TikTok pushes pushes an algorithm. Like the reason why you go crazy viral on TikTok is they want 80% of all distribution to come from a few thousand pieces of content a day. They bias towards content that is international for that reason. So when you do a funny dance, they can show it to you anywhere in the world, a makeup tutorial anywhere in the world. If they can get it down to a few thousand pieces of content a day, they can literally check every single piece of content to make sure they like it. So let's say China invades Taiwan. They can go through and be like, no talking bad about China today. A couple of years ago, there was a scandal because they were taking down every video that was had a visibly gay or a visibly disabled person in it. And their rationale was they want to protect people from being bullied. TikTok is only safe because it is moderated. Like when you have these hyper-algorithmic systems where we know that people our limbic system biases us towards engaging with extreme content. Like we're attracted to gore, we're attracted to violence, we're attracted to extreme emotions. If you don't go in and moderate that system, the stuff that's gonna go hyper-viral is all extreme content.
And they're moderating the use of TikTok for their own kids, right?
Oh, yeah. And the secondary thing is if you want us to come and say, like, Francis, is this really nefarious? Like, do they have a plan? TikTok in China is a different product. If you're under 18, that's what a child is, not under 13 like in the United States. If you're under 18, you can only use it 45 minutes a day. Your account is tied to an ID. It cuts off at 10 o'clock. You can't get sleep deprived on TikTok. It shows you content about why you want to be a doctor, like an engineer, educational videos. That seems odd, like they're making those choices.
And how many minutes is the average of American teenage use
I think
of TikTok?
it's up to like 89 minutes a day for American teenagers. And like that's why and that's actually why Facebook is trying to pivot away from Instagram to TikTok, right? It used to be that you could do Instagram and like watch Netflix simultaneously. And so like your enjoyment of Netflix didn't cannibalize Instagram. If anything, it made you do more Instagram. And on TikTok, unless you keep moving the videos forward, you don't get another video. So it's a forced trade-off. And they're watching their minutes go down, and they're like, oh, this won't do.
All right, time for a couple more quick questions. Back there. Here.
Hi, I'm Aftab from the Maxwell School at McGill. So I want to flip the coin a little bit and ask you about when nation states or political governments use social media as mediums of spreading disinformation and propaganda. For example, 6 years ago or so, I think in Myanmar, Burmese military regime, in a close affinity with their supporting actors, mobilized a campaign against the Rohingya refugees, and that led to the largest refugee crisis in the world. And Facebook was accused of being the platform where ethnic clashes were promoted. In India, you saw how WhatsApp was used as a medium to promote ethnic clashes between Hindus and Muslims prior to elections. So my question is quite simple. Should there be a multilateral forum to ensure that state-sponsored propaganda on social media does not take place? And should there be a role for social media companies to ensure that states, governments, don't use social media to spread propaganda or hate? Thank you.
Yes, yeah. It sounds like those sound like great ideas to me. I don't know how realistic those ideas are, just because so many countries see this as sort of an aspect of their foreign policy now, or they're, even preparing the ground for military conflicts. I don't know what the chances are of getting the United States and Russia and China and India, together and agreeing on something like this. But yes, it would be a great thing. I think that this is a real issue on social media now, that the lack of transparency about why you're seeing what you're seeing, and a piece of that is this state disinformation, right? You don't know who is behind this piece of content. We've seen this in the U.S. now, from multiple countries over the last few years, where increasingly sophisticated social media campaigns are used to exploit divisions that already exist in American society. And my assumption is that the United States is engaged in similar things, and in other countries. Although I don't know. It would be a great thing if your ideas took hold. I hope they do.
So I am strongly against laws against misinformation. And the reason for that is I think it's very hard to write definitions on misinformation or disinformation. Because right now, like, the best influence campaigns are not using fake facts. They're using true facts that are divisive. And the thing that I do think we should have laws against is coordinated inauthentic behavior. And I think if you are going to act in a coordinated way on a social platform, you should have to disclose that, right? That social platforms work when we believe we're engaging with people we can trust, or like when we can, if we're hearing 6 voices, they should be from 6 people. And if there are from 6 people who are working in concert, I think you should be allowed to operate on the platforms, but you should have to register. And it's one of those things where if we just dealt with bots, right? Like, one of the top things I want to do next year is talk about accounting standards, right? Sounds like, Francis, what does that have to do with misinformation? But right now, there are active disincentives for these companies to take down bots. You can have 1% fewer users and your stock price can fall 10%. But those bots are really dangerous. It means that you can start having a drumbeat. You can at any moment turn it on and start amplifying out stuff that makes it look like there's consensus. And that erodes democracy.
Thanks. Yeah, Helen, last question maybe up in the front? Oh, or is there one back there too? Yeah. Okay, last 2 more quick ones. One in the back, one up front.
Thank you so much. I have a question about how democratic elections are going to work in the future, because social media have a bad influence on hate speech, threats that people who want to run for office are scared of having. So I just wanted to see what was your vision of like the future's elections regarding this.
So, we spent the last hour and some number of minutes bashing social media. I think that social media deserves all of the criticism we've given it, but that's not all there is to social media, right? There's also the fact that a lot of people whose voices previously wouldn't have been heard by anyone can now be heard. A lot of political movements that would never have got off the ground because social media gave people the tools to do that. Some of the cases that I've been involved in the United States involve public officials' use of social media. So we sued President Trump over his practice of blocking critics from his Twitter account. We made the argument that his Twitter account was a public forum within the meaning of the First Amendment, and that his blocking of critics violated the First Amendment because it was viewpoint discrimination. And the result was that a lot of people that Trump didn't want participating in public discourse were able to participate in public discourse. But one other result is that public officials are subject to a lot of speech that ranges from critical and sharp to abusive and harassing. I think that's a really significant problem, in part because the people who are most often subjected to this kind of speech are women and minorities who are driven out of the political process by this abuse. I think that the platforms could do a lot more to give public officials tools that they can use in viewpoint neutral ways to keep that kind of content out of their accounts. But I think it's a really significant problem that the platforms could do more than they've done thus far to address.
I think this is one of those things where we have been really limited. You actually made a point really early on that I thought was spot on, which was one of the things that we have lost as the public by not getting to see behind the curtain on these platforms, or not get to see the data, or by not having professionals like me be trained anywhere except for inside the companies, right? We're going to Mars because Elon Musk can hire aeronautical engineers with PhDs for SpaceX. That's why we're going to Mars. Inside of Facebook, and inside of any of these companies, the only people who have my skill set are people who trained inside those companies for a decade, right? There's very, very few of us, and we churn out because we get burned out. You know, what would it look like? You know, we know that a disproportionate fraction of the people who give that hate, you know, they do the sexist slurs, the racist slurs, they're not very creative. Like, they do the same things over and over again. It's a limited space of things. They often repeat their behavior. Imagine if there was like a penalty box where we're like, hey, we know there's a whole problem with sexism. The UK is actually seeing a whole bunch of senior politicians, women politicians, for the first time drop off in mass. Right, we're seeing it in the United States also. Imagine we came and said, we know sexism exists. If you are boring in your sexism, you're gonna go in the sexism box. And you can still, anyone who wants to read your comments can go in there, and you can see the giant long screed of people saying like, you're ugly, you're a whore, right? It's over and over again. I'm gonna kill you, watch out, you know? But we don't get to have creative discussions about like, should we have a penalty box for people who yell, you know, whatever that slur is at you? That's one of the things I hope we can begin doing is like, what if we had more public conversations about what could solutions look like? Because we don't have to be passive. The way we've solved every problem before is
First of all, thank you. It was very interesting. My name is Isabella Spano. I'm a doctoral student at McGill University Faculty of Law. So I am extremely interested in this, especially because I'm doing my PhD in global governance and regulation of platforms and etc. Do they know the meaning of language? Do they know what it means? Civil society groups can stand for in certain situations, because at the end of the day, there is no stake for you, an American person, an English person, an Irish person, in that context. Yeah. I think that was also like flagged, for example, in a very, very interesting article from 2018 from Kate Klonick. She's actually going to talk tomorrow. I love that article. I reread it yesterday about the cultural bias. Also, for example, the application of the First Amendment to what is free speech, right? There is a limited understanding. And since the event that we're in, like this 3 days events about global governance and online harms, the idea of global governance is not just states, for example, as was previously mentioned about the participation of multilateral states representatives trying to talk about, hey, what can we do, understandably, but also what can civil society do, and how likely are platforms to care about civil society.
A giant report after Myanmar. It was like 200, 300 pages long, and said, this is what went wrong. This is all the low-hanging fruit that Facebook just didn't do, or like, this is where they messed up. And the issue was they had one person in the company that spoke Burmese. That person was a very, very low-level worker. They didn't have routes of escalation. They reported to their boss, or maybe their boss's boss, and it just kind of evaporated, because it wasn't in the metrics. It wasn't like a thing that people were looking for. And the issue was that Facebook's their way of talking to the public was so scaled that there wasn't like a checkbox that these nonprofits could be like, they're like, genocide is happening, you know, like, I need to report an issue. And so they actually started a secondary reporting chain, but that program is not scaled, right? It's a program that should be scaled, and they should think about like, how do you scale this such that any place where we believe there is risk of ethnic violence, we have ways of knowing. But unfortunately, Facebook defunded the team that I was on, which was Civic Integrity, that was working on issues like that. And so I totally agree with you, they should be a big part of the process. It's just right now, unless we change the incentives, unless we have mandatory transparency, unless we change the market incentives, it's not gonna get done.
So, as you've heard, this is such a really wicked set of challenges we're faced with here. And I believe really profoundly that getting this right, particularly from a policies perspective, is really one of the most urgent challenges facing democratic societies. The reliability of information and how we engage with each other as citizens is critical to functioning democracies. And one of the things I feel most fortunate about is getting to wrestle with some of these questions with people like Francis and Jameel. So thank you for coming here. Thank you for doing this in public with me, with us, and for all the work you do.
Thank you.
Can I end on a happy note?
Please
Does
do.
anyone want to end on a happy-note?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I do a lot of these conversations, and we talk about really dark things, and it's really easy to come out and be like, multi-hundred-billion-dollar company, destruction of democracy, genocide. You know, it's a downer, right? We're talking about really serious, really scary things. Like, it's easy to feel powerless. It's really easy to feel small. And I want to reassure you about what has happened before. So every single time we've invented a new form of media, it has been very disruptive. Like when we started doing newspapers, like cheap newspapers, like good ones, we started having wars. We had yellow journalism, misinformation caused wars, right? This is not new that hundreds of thousands of people would die. Radio, people had personal relationships with their leaders for the first time. That also meant that you could inspire people to hate in ways that were never possible before. It feels overwhelming because it is overwhelming.
Is it supposed to be positive?
No, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. It feels overwhelming because we're talking about really serious things. But every single time before we learned, like we went through it, it might get worse before it gets better. I'm not going to gloss over this. But every time we learned, we wrestled with the process. We take for granted that we can sit in nice warm rooms with interesting people and have interesting conversations because we live in a safe society, because it has just been that way. We live in the world we live in because people did the work, because people believed the world could get better. And they did the work and they tried out things, they got things wrong, they got better. We are going to figure this out. This is not new. It's just a new communication medium. And so I want you to go out into the world and try, right? I want you to imagine that the world could be better. And I want you to just keep coming up with ideas because we have done this before and we're gonna do it again. But the first step is we have to believe that we can. So thank you guys for coming today.
Thanks, everybody. I'd be remiss not to note there's some wine at the back, refreshments at the back. Please feel free to stick around. And Francis and Jameel will be here too.